As Americans celebrate 250 years of independence, the fight over how their history should be told has become part of the anniversary itself. President Donald Trump says America should tell a more patriotic story.
Everything discussed is how horrible our country is, how bad slavery was. Nothing about success, nothing about brightness, nothing about the future. We're not going to allow this to happen.
Through executive orders, his administration has been reviewing and changing how American history is presented in museums, historic sites, and national parks. One of the clearest examples is Philadelphia's President's House. For years, visitors learned not only about George Washington and the founding of the United States, but also about the enslaved people who lived and worked there. But the National Park Service display with details about the enslaved people kept by America's first president was removed in January under the Trump administration's orders.
The aim was to interpret not just the founding of the United States, which of course is ubiquitous in Philadelphia, but to also interpret slavery. And so this was one of the primary things that the administration went after. They really didn't want to be, something that visitors would encounter.
Critics say the White House is rewriting history.
We are watching in real time as they remove the history of slavery from national parks. They're trying to remove a lot of content and things from the African American History Museum as well. This country was built by enslaved African people. I think it's really disrespectful, honestly, to the folks who actually make this country run, to pretend like our efforts and our labor isn't actually what makes this country, quote unquote, so great.
But many conservatives believe public institutions have spent too much time emphasizing America's failures and too little celebrating its achievements. For them, the country's 250th anniversary is an opportunity to restore a stronger sense of national pride. Historian Greg Fraser sees both sides of the coin.
I've never been to a birthday party in which everybody focused on the negative things about that person. It was that America had bad things in their past and they fixed them.
Fraser says both conservatives and progressives sometimes use history to support today's political arguments. Can you give me an example where you think the political left has rewritten history?
They act as if we haven't advanced in the last 50 years, and they want to rewrite history such that, for example, we haven't had a black president for 8 years. Both sides, they want to rewire things and to focus on different things.
Yet, Fraser also believes President Trump has gone further than previous administrations in changing how history is presented.
But they didn't do it the way Trump has done it, which is, changing buildings and changing signs on buildings and presentations. So he's been more aggressive.
But for indigenous people, America's story did not begin in 1776, and the debate is even more fundamental.
Like, we were here long before that story began. And I know Native Americans carry a lot of pride and a lot of pain with that too.
Thousands of years before the United States was founded, hundreds of indigenous nations lived across North America. Yet many Native Americans say their history is still largely absent from the country's founding narrative.
There's ideas that are recognized like liberty and self-governance, but also remembering that there were promises that often didn't include Native people and sometimes came at the cost of our lands, cultures, and lives.
Americans around the country are taking part in this year's independence celebrations, but questions over how the country's history should be remembered still leave many in the United States divided.
Well, Michael D. Hattem is a leading historian of the American Revolutionary era and the way it's remembered. His books include Past and Prologue, Politics and Memory in the American Revolution. His most recent work, The Declaration of Independence, A Concise History, will be published in November. Welcome to the day. As someone who's dedicated his career to this period of American history, how special do you regard this 250th anniversary to be?
Well, it's a special occasion. It only comes around every 50 years or so, every 50 years. The previous anniversaries have been quite significant moments in American history, from the first anniversary in 1826 to the centennial, which happened at a really tumultuous period in American history, right down to most recently the bicentennial in the 1970s. And these have been really significant moments in American history.
And in an age of social media and superhero movies, how compelling is America's origin story for younger generations?
Well, traditionally, it has been quite compelling. It has effectively been our origin myth for over 200 years, and we have told the story of the revolution in a very similar way to many sort of superhero stories. If we think, you think of the story structure of the hero's journey. Basically, the story of the American Revolution sort of follows that story structure, and so for a long time, Americans have had really sort of emotional responses to the story of the revolution. In the current age, it's maybe less so, but I'm not sure how much that's a function of social media or whatnot, as much as it is also perhaps a function of changes in history education in the United States.
Okay, let's dig deeper there, because, okay, different ways of teaching history, but also different views of history, different voices being heard, different voices having access to wider audiences as well. So it becomes less one story, doesn't it? The story fractures.
In a sense, it has become. Well, there have always been multiple stories of the revolution. There's never been just one story. That's a sort of a common misconception. It is true that students today in the United States encounter a very different story of the revolution than students would have even 50 years ago. They are likely to learn a story about the revolution that focuses more on its consequences than its causes. They're likely to learn a story about the revolution that features a much wider cast of characters, a much more diverse story of the revolution than students would have 50 years ago. And that doesn't necessarily make for many more different narratives about the revolution, but it does make for a sort of a more diverse narrative.
And what about the central cast in this story, the founding fathers, who seem to us non-Americans to be treated within your country as sort of infallible, mythical people from the past, and indeed documents like your Constitution, which seem to achieve this Bible-like status?
Yeah, that is a trend that began in the early 19th century. Especially after George Washington's death in 1799, when that's when he becomes the sort of father of the nation. And the memory of the revolution for a very long time after that was focused on a few elite individuals, a few elite white males. And there has been a long process throughout American history of trying to include more people in that story beyond the founders. That's not just a more recent story. The first histories of ordinary soldiers in the revolution goes back to the 1820s. The first stories, the first books about African Americans in the revolution is published in 1850. And the first book about women in the revolution is published in 1851. So we have a long this process of creating a more diverse narrative of the revolution is a long tradition in how we have remembered the revolution, all sort of in response to the predominance of the sort of founding fathers, as you say.
Okay, so it's a constant push and pull, and the story isn't settled.
No, the story is always changing. I mean, the thing about the memory of the revolution is that it's very malleable. Throughout American history, people have been able to see themselves and their political agendas and their goals in the revolution, from the furthest left on the political spectrum to the furthest right, because of that, how we have remembered the revolution has always been contested. There have always been, multiple directly conflicting memories of the revolution. And that is part of the process and part of the value of the memory of the revolution, because it has provided Americans with a sort of shared political language. When we use terms like, liberty or equality or tyranny or resistance, those words have connotations that go back to the revolution. So the revolution gives us this language that we can use to express our sort of political beliefs in the present and our visions of the future.
Right. So can you give us, again, for the education of us as non-Americans, can you give us examples in the push and pull of this narrative of perhaps heroes who people who were once regarded as heroes who were then regarded as villains and maybe back again, or people who were forgotten, who have been foregrounded?
Yeah, so it's not so much that people go from being heroes to being villains.
I'm guessing the British started off as villains and just stayed there.
Well, that is true. I was thinking specifically of America, but you are right that for most of the 19th century, Britons played the role of evil villain in the story of the revolution. I was talking about the how we tell the story of the revolution. In America, the story has typically been told in a sort of superhero fashion, in the sense of, this is a cast of unlikely underdogs who undertakes this fight against the world's most evil empire, right? And achieves victory against all odds. That's why, in some sense, the Star Wars is the great bicentennial movie, right? Because it reflects how we tell the story of the revolution. But of course, that changes in the early 20th century, when relations between the United States and Great Britain becomes much more friendly. And in fact, I tell a story in my most recent book about the man who made the first feature film about the American Revolution in 1917, just as World War I was starting for the United States. And in the film, he included some scenes that featured sort of British actions that were, let's say, less than moral. There's some scenes of basically British soldiers assaulting Americans. And before that film was debuted in 1917, he was told to cut those offending scenes because it would arouse bitterness amongst Americans against their sort of new ally. And when he did not cut the offending scenes, he was actually arrested for treason under the Espionage Act and sent to 10 years in federal prison. So, you get a sense of how the way that the role that Britain played in the memory of the revolution could change very quickly in the early 20th century. So much so that the man who made that first film was jailed for it. So in a big celebration like this, in a country as old as it is, in a country that has, as you say, these superhero elements to it, there are villains and tyrannies, not just of the external, but the internal. The United States has a dark history as well. How do you balance the patriotism and the rah-rah with the unpleasant truths associated with the founding of this country? Slavery, the genocide of Native Americans. That has been an important part of the memory of the revolution, primarily in the last 50 to 75 years. How Americans balance that or reconcile those what one historian called the American paradox, which is the revolution built on a rhetoric of liberty, all while amidst the existence of slavery, right, and the treatment of Native Americans. That has been a thing that Americans have had to work out for themselves on an individual basis. In the United States, we basically have two forms of patriotism, and have had since the early 20th century. And one form of patriotism, which is primarily more conservative, is based on a more sort of triumphal understanding of the past, a more celebratory understanding of the past, one that focuses on a few elite individuals while on the sort of left end of the political spectrum, they have taken a sort of more critical approach to the past, especially the revolution, with a desire to try to highlight that paradox, and so trying to reconcile, those contradictions within the nation's history and the stories that we tell about ourselves is a sort of ongoing process that each American has to engage with for themselves.
Thanks for talking us through that so clearly and so interesting. Historian and author Michael D. Hatton.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe AI World.